Hello, and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
This is me, Bronze.
This is me, I am.
And on today's much delayed episode, we're going to talk about Marxism.
Yeah, and more generally, the relationship between Marx, counter-revolutionary thought, and integralism, I think would be a sort of fair term. But basically, Marx and anti-revolutionary thought, monarchism, so forth. And I think to begin, there's something that I think basically we should highlight, which is the concept of organicism that we find in the concept of organicism that we find in counter enlightenment thought. So basically, when you have people like De Meister, when you have Herder, or not even Herder, Hamann, these kinds of people, obviously, I think Schelling would be a good example of this. Schelling is very good example of this. Their core idea that they really cling to, as opposed to what they see in the normal enlightenment of, say, Voltaire, Hume, Locke, is the concept of organicism as opposed to some kind of rationalism. And so what is interesting basically about this concept is this concept, they have this idea of development, natural development, that you find in nations, that sort of nations and peoples and cultures are a natural part of life, rather than, say, this Voltairean idea that it's developed. And you can see some of this in the basic sort of elements of Romanticism in general. That Romanticism in general has this idea of Romanticism has this idea of the natural as opposed to culture, as opposed to like artificiality, and these sort of similar things. And what we find, especially in, say, Schelling, and a lot of Schelling's later works, and Schelling has a big influence here on Marx, is the concept of like development and organicism, opposed to the kind of rationality that characterizes the Enlightenment. And that the interesting element then of this is that basically this idea kind of mediates and permeates integralism and like from what I can tell, at least, parts of distributist thought and various other elements of the right, where the European right, where there is this concept of like an organic nation, and the unity of the organic unity of the sort of king and the people, and these kinds of ideas, that there exists this organic, natural state that society and the state in general should exist in, and that various elements act to impede this or constrain this, and this where you find this kind of idea is quite interesting. I mean, Rousseau has this basic notion, which is quite ironic, considering Rousseau really is the guy against whom everyone reacts. Voltaire famously hated Rousseau precisely for his organicism, Rousseau has a lot of these kind of proto-romantic, these kind of proto-romantic elements that, I mean, they're the reason why later liberals have come to sort of try to disown him at times.
I mean, a lot of people trace Romanticism back to Rousseau.
Yeah, and that's kind of the interesting thing that people sort of seem to forget about Rousseau, especially in modern discourse by monarchists and so forth, that they locate the error, as it were, with Rousseau. I think quite arbitrarily, largely because of Robespierre. Though, I mean, it's debatable the extent to which Robespierre is like executing what Rousseau would have wanted. I mean, like Rousseau wanted, he wanted Swiss-style cantons, very local, minimal state. He was very opposed to like high culture or anything like this. I mean, and so the interesting element then, basically, having sketched this general background that you have, rationality as it's understood by people like Voltaire, by people like David Hume, Locke, Kant to a certain degree, that it's this kind of, there is the rational higher man, and that he, orders society, whatever, like whatever the specifics are. Compared to this, then you get the concepts of, say, Rousseau, Schelling, Hamann, Herder to a degree. So Romanticism, so forth, where it's this concept of where the leading principle is like the organic, the natural, and the self-expression of a people or nation or group, as the case may be, and the organization of the self-organization of these people. Now, obviously, examples of where this crops up in the right is integralism, especially Portuguese integralism. I mean, Kos can probably talk about this more, but it's very explicit with concepts like organic kingdoms.
Yes, and yes, the organicism just refers to like it's hard to, especially to explain nowadays, now that we live in an age of dominated by the idea of nation state. But basically, it's organicism, at least in the Portuguese context, is a very emotional thing. It says that politics should be limited to the community you feel attracted to. So basically, the maximum amount of people that identify themselves as a separate community is the working bloc, essentially. Other types of integralism were influenced differently or had a different definition, but the Portuguese one was very emotive. Others were based upon towns or villages, or on a more abstract sense. Others based upon ancient divisions. But generally speaking, organicism in this context means like emergent, which back then was seen as reflected in its antiquity, e.i. that it emerged in itself. B, self-identification, though not quite political self-identification as we say it, but like when you go into a town and there's a clear notion that everyone knows one another and etc., that degree of self-identification. And third, a lack of performance, like a certain, it's a very romantic, I suppose, term here, but of a certain spontaneity that's not performative. So that organicism in this context means those three things wherever applicable. Each or all of them are applicable.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good definition. I think that's a very good. Yeah, I mean that generally sums up, I think, the generalized opinion. That, I think, that basically perfectly encapsulates it. And the interesting element then of how this relates to socialism the basically, if we think about the, obviously now we like to think of the left in terms of, you know, these categories like communism, anarchism, so on and so forth. What people generally don't seem to understand, at least a lot of, I mean, this is just in general, is the way in which um, Marxism emerged historically. And so a good example of this is that what a lot of people fail to realize now is that Marx himself did very little actual ideological legwork. Most of his writings are polemics against other people, um, or um, or say like just sort of statistical work. And the most interesting element really is if you look at the people who he's interacting with initially, and it's, you know, it's people like Proudhon, Proudhon and Bruno Bauer and the, you know, the young Hegelians, the and by and large these people are romantics, and then by and large the political, like there is a kind of large overlap between politics and aesthetics, and this concept of organicism is, as far as I can tell, basically always constant in the background. The You see this especially with Fourier. Like Fourier understands, and Fourier is slightly before Marx's time, but Fourier understands communism in a very naturalistic, is the only way I can really describe it, manner. So he literally thinks that communism will bring about the development of species like anti-lions, is his term, which means lions that are peaceable. And like Fourier essentially, as far as I can tell, I think the quickest way to describe it is that he essentially applies Lamarckian evolution, so the concept of evolution by the will, to Christianity as such. That's basically what he's doing. You see a similar tendency even with Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon is the main other Marxist, and then Owen. Owen is very much Robert Owen, I believe his first name was Robert Owen, and these three are the primary socialists who Engels cites as the formative socialists that impact Marx and himself. And they were all uniformly mystics, for one thing. And I mean that in the sense that they believed in magic, and alchemy and spiritualism. And secondarily, what you see, especially with people like Owen, is a very, very deep romanticism. And Owen's political ideology really only makes sense if you understand it emerging from the concept of like merry old England. It's the sort of a Norman saw on English oak, Norman yoke on English neck, Norman spoon in English dish, and England nevermore shall be at peace until England's rid of all three. And that's the kind of milieu that Marx and Engels are explicitly citing as the thing that they are emerging from, is essentially romanticism and political romanticism, and the belief that that essentially that the bourgeoisie and the elite are in a certain way systematically preventing the true self-expression of humanity. And this in its most extreme form, you get something like the Paris manuscripts, where Marx literally says that communism will be subsumption into the Godhead, as in like that communism will be when man's existence is reconciled with his essence, is his literal wording. And all of these sorts of ideas that we see are basically mediated by romanticism, by organicism, and that they are emerging from this kind of background of mysticism, and a specific kind of like Lamarckian organic mysticism that, and I mean this is kind of the weird elements that people sort of forget about, is that, say, Marx initially understands something like even as fundamental as class, basically as a kind of genetic category. The bourgeoisie are characterized as inbred, as weak, as and counterposed to sort of proletarian vitality. You see this especially with the lumpen proletariat, that the lumpen proletariat are characterized as degenerate, as lacking in sort of vital strength. And what is kind of very interesting about all of this is that the kind of, I mean, for one thing, I should make it clear, I don't think he's Marx is a racist. I mean, this is quite similar actually in many ways to certain currents of like French European proto-eugenicism, where it's like race mixing is good. Marx definitely agrees with that sort of element. That's why like inbreeding is the bad part. And the interesting sort of generalized overlap here basically is that at the same time that the right is beginning to define and monarchism is beginning to define its own discourse, that we see in things like integralism, like the sort of the defense of natural hierarchy, these sorts of things, you see a concurrent formation of the basic principles of socialism. And this basic formation is emerging from the same sources, namely counter-enlightenment thought.
So sorry to cut you off. So it could be said that both sprung up from the same thing, correct?
Yes, basically, and it seems to me,
That
in terms of the primary originary difference, the primary difference that I can see is that Marx is critical, essentially, of any kind of hierarchy that is not ad hoc. So any kind of hierarchy that is like non-organic is understood to be bad. And you see this especially with things like the concept of the Gemeinwesen or Gemeinwesen, which is the community. And Marx understands this is actually a very important element, at least sorry. This is a very important element then, in that the critique basically of the utopian socialists and the anarchists was that they did not center themselves enough upon presently existing communities, specifically the proletariat. That, and this is where you get the critique then of Proudhon as well, that Marx understands the existence of the proletariat as something unnatural, and that because it is because basically it is the natural tendency of all things to return to their source, the proletariat will abolish itself, and that and consequent to that, the coming of communism is the return to the Garden of Eden. To put it very plainly, and I mean, I think
Also, to give some context to the listener, because it just occurred to me that perhaps not every single one of our listeners has such a solid grounding on Marx. A lot of what is being said here is based upon writings that Marx did, but were not widely available in the formative years of communism. So, like mid to late 1800s, these documents did exist, and these reflect Marx's opinions, but such things as the Grundrisse and etc. were not translated either to English or French, which therefore limited for quite a long while their wider dissemination amongst leftist thought. So when we're talking about socialism and communism, this is socialism and communism as it was when Marx was when the paint was still wet, when Marx was writing.
And a lot of the stuff didn't get published until the Soviets.
So the Grundrisse wasn't translated into English until the 70s. The Paris manuscripts weren't translated until the 60s, I believe. And yeah, I mean, the Grundrisse is interesting because it killed, like when it was published, it basically killed a whole bunch of theories that had existed, because it became clear by the 50s and the 60s that early Marx was a romantic, and that was undeniable. And some people were debating over that, and the implications that had for Marx's the relationship with capital to that stuff.
Yes. I would even argue that you see Marx's romanticism in his critiques of the reactionary socialists and the feudal socialists, where there's oddly light in what one would expect would be actual targets of leftist venom. So I would argue that there are evidence of that in his already published works.
I mean, that's actually an important point as well. Marx, in most of his writings, is far more critical of what we would now call democratic socialists and liberals, basically, than he is of the right. I mean, yeah, you see this with like the concept of clerical socialism, feudal socialism, and reactionary socialism, which are all basically the same concept. He attacks very violently. I mean, in his early writings, this attack this attack on liberalism is very strong. I mean, he specifically rejects the concept of atheism as bourgeois, and if you know anything about Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach, who were the contemporaries, they were very explicitly saying, radical emancipatory politics has to be founded upon the rejection of religion. And Marx's writings, even from this very early period, when he's reacting to these really what you could call democratic socialists, social democrats, what I don't know, state socialist might be a good term.
I mean, at the time, wouldn't they be considered just radicals before radicalism became a verb?
They would have been called radicals or Jacobins, but like now they would be called like a radlib, basically. And he's like very explicit in his attacks against, especially Bauer. I mean, he writes a whole book on the Jewish question, basically mocking Bauer. And the whole point, I mean, of these kinds of writings is that the the and I mean, this is like, you know, opioid of the masses. The concept of the opioid of the masses really, and I think this is a good example of this, is that he understands religion basically in the context of state Lutheranism and state Lutheranism and Catholicism. So it's like he attacks state Lutheranism because he believes state Lutheranism is ridiculous. He attacks Judaism for the same reasons, and it's like pathetic, basically. And Catholicism is the same. It's that it's like this, but essentially that it's not natural. It's the attack that it is something constructed by humans, and that it is not reflective of true reality, as it were. The obvious irony, I think, or the interesting irony, is that I would characterize this almost as an attempt of an auto-critique of Christianity. I think what he's interested in doing, because especially like the concept of Christian's understanding of like what religion is as a natural fulfillment of our needs. The same is true of monarchist understandings of the monarch, that the monarch is the highest expression of the family. You know, the nation are the children of the monarch, and he seems to essentially be attempting to perform an auto-critique of that. So it's saying this itself is not, cannot be reflective of true reality, and so he basically attacks this concept as being and so he attacks these concepts as but as perversions, I think, is probably the best idea, or best use of the term. To sort of move slightly from Marx, I think the interesting point, and what you highlighted earlier, was about the relationship between the development of communism and these kinds of history development at the time, and these early writings, is that obviously most of this is not published at the time, and so people didn't know this. Now, that wasn't, as far as I can tell, much of an issue for Marx's contemporaries. Marx's contemporaries, by and large, are, he's having fights with socialist radicals who are couching their understandings of socialism in the explicit language of Christian eschatology. There was a I can't remember his name now, but Feuerbach does this, but especially Dietzgen is another guy who does this as well.
For the viewer, when again we must remind ourselves, not everyone has as much schooling as Marx as we do, though largely me and Bronze have it via osmosis rather than direct readings. But when I am saying here about couching it in Christian eschatological terminology, this means that, largely speaking, all communists, and arguably they still do, see communism or the anti-capitalist as inevitable as the Judgment Day is for Christians. So when they couch on that, it is on that degree of severity and on that degree of necessity to be more poignant.
Yeah, socialism, it's the classical phrase of socialism or barbarism, i.e., Christ or death is like the basic, and in this early period, in Saint-Simon, I think, is the most explicit in this. Saint-Simon himself is actually continuing in the tradition of Rousseau, and he specifically understands socialism as and the sort of ideal state, basically, as overcoming Christian sectarianism. So he understands it basically as a Christian unity movement. There's later German radicals who are more working class, like people who've self-educated, and they by and large are coming out, and they are coming from these kinds of radical Christian traditions, like parts of Calvinism, like Anabaptism, and so forth, and they're coming out and saying, when Christ comes, there will be the unity of all men, and like socialism, like, and quite explicitly by the time that Marx is around. In earlier periods, there's a guy called Oettinger. Oettinger is an influential theologian, though a lot of his influence goes unattested, largely because he was quite controversial, so people didn't want to say that they followed Oettinger. But Oettinger, the interesting element there is that and Oettinger underlies the theology, the philosophy of Hegel and Schelling, the two largest influences on Marx and Engels. And he explicitly comes out and, he says, the day of judgment is near, and he understands the French Revolution as being the first sign of the end times, and saying, once Christ returns to us, then we shall have all knowledge, all ideology, all false pretension will be overturned, destroyed, and there will be the community of goods, all from all to all, and these kinds of explicit, he's very explicit that what he understands paradise to be is basically what we would now call communism. And
to a slight aside, but to the average listener, who's a tad bit more familiar with like 1820s thought and 1830s, will notice how well, and really it should be self-evident by this point, how early counter-revolutionary thought and what amounts to basically early Marxism here were essentially the same thing. Generally speaking, when they started splitting is the point of debate. That's that some say 1848, some say earlier. That's not the discussion here. Is that Marx, at least early Marx, not late Marx, or the interpretisms of Marx, is essentially a product of this counter-revolutionary romantic narrative. And so a lot of these influences, especially religious, cultural, etc., are from this now lost, sadly, milieu that formulate a lot of the early, like let me put it like this. If these kinds of stuffs were so opposed, why would Prussia later adopt state socialism, for example? Why would there be for a certain time until like the 1880s in other European states a tacit alliance between the monarchical regime and what we would now consider leftists against the liberals and the Republicans? The issue was that because there was not seen any difference, to really put the dots on the i's, during the Bourbon Restoration, the Vedettes, the Charles X supporters, basically, who were in the South doing what basically amounts to property seizure and redistribution, basically screwing over the bureaucrats and proto-capitalists and other Napoleonic toadies in favor of it. Yeah.
The time, yeah, you see this, that the big thing that the French Revolution did was it divvied up church land and sold that off, and a lot of that was restored, and the restoration of that essentially meant that the peasants became richer. And so the interesting element, basically, then to get somewhere, as it were, is to get to the next stage, as it were. The way that this mediates is not only in the milieu and like through socialism, it has a significant effect on the formative years of like socialist theory, rather than something like Das Kapital, which is meant to be more empirical. The philosophy, quote unquote, of Marxism, and the primary mediator of that is basically Engels. Engels, and what is interesting about Engels is that Engels' critique of Hegel, that is very influential in Marxist circles, um, is essentially Schelling's critique of Hegel. Schelling, for those who don't know, was a hermeticist and an alchemist, and the second most influential philosopher in Germany after Hegel. His critique of Hegel basically underlies all anti-Hegelians since Hegel, basically. Engels' critique follows him. Kierkegaard's critique follows him. Like the postmodernists, Koyev, like Heidegger. If there is someone who is anti-Hegel in the 20th, like who's coherent,
And they took from Schelling.
They took from Schelling, and the basically the interesting element there is that the kind of Schellingianism of Engels is very overt in things like the dialectics of nature. I mean, the dialectics of nature, if you actually look at like what the philosophy is, I mean, it's if anyone knows about like Indian philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, or like anything like that, it's very similar that what you find in Engels, and he really is the one who has the most formative influence on, especially on like Lenin. And I mean, it's the reason why it's Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, or Mao, is explicitly because Engels is the guy who gives, it's like Marx does a single line question, like says this about Hegel. People then go, oh, what did Marx mean by that? Engels responds and gives his critique, which is Schelling's critique, and is sort of mediated by what can only be called Schelling's organicism. And this is not to say that Hegel isn't also an organicist. Hegel was also an organicist, and you see this especially in his philosophy of right, and his philosophy of right. I mean, that, like, it's even, yeah. And so and even actually in Marx's critique of his philosophy of right, Marx shows this element of Marx actually seems to quote an early Hegelian text called the oldest systematic program of German idealism, wherein Hegel or Schelling says philosophy and mythology must join hands, and mythology must become rational. And like Marx says that basically the philosopher and the proletarian must join hands to realize communism, and like basically render the proletarian rational and like self-liberation, all this sort of jazz. And the interesting element, obviously, then is that basically what I think we can describe Marx's philosophy as is political organicism, would be the quickest way I think one could describe it. There's some interesting elements later on in that you get people like Plekhanov and Katowski, who are the big other two deans of Marxism after Engels dies. Katowski obviously interacting with having been Katowski, I think, was the last major person who knew knew Marx personally, and sort of had interacted with him, and he
I think we're having some technical problems, so let's so to just
Ad break.
haha. So just a small recap here while we try to suss this out. So what I am is saying is that, boiling it down to its most basic components, is that Marxist, and when here we say Marxist as in the philosophy, literal what Marx thought and said, not Marxism, the consequent interpretation of this, is
Marx said not what Marxists said.
exactly, is that it is essentially a call to a return to, okay, to put this in more open terms, he saw the entire capital structure as a class-based society as essentially degenerate and fabricated. So rich, middle class, and poor were, and in of this the existence of the proletariat in of itself as a natural, as a product of capitalism. And fundamentally, what he wanted was a return to either a pre-capitalistic society or to a society that did not have capitalism. Full stop. This brings up the tired old joke of communism wanting to bring back palace economy, all the more relevant. Though I do think it has a point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, yeah, I mean, I think, especially when you see, say, certain strands of Leninism and state socialism, I think that is an a correct assessment. I think where to sort of make it more concise, basically, what Marx sees history as, is that we come into existence in a state of immediacy, that we are in our surroundings just naturally, and we live in them, and we're there vibing, as it were, and then society develops, and because society is primitive, it becomes, or sorry, not primitive society is still communist. So what happens basically is that as society develops, to prevent violence, you get the development of property, and like ownership. And once this happens, we're now out of the immediacy. We're out of the garden at this point, Garden of Eden. And having come out of the Garden of Eden, Marx believes it is not possible to simply return to the garden that has been blocked from us. If it was possible, it would only be possible through some kind of regression to barbarism. Rather, what he sees in this state of alienation is that we can basically come to self-consciousness of the immediacy and return to the immediacy through our self-knowledge. And so, as far as he is concerned, what capitalism is, what capitalism produces, is an absolutely pure class society. And obviously here there is an element here of the Hermeticism and Organicism, mysticism in general, this concept of purity and purification, that class society purifies itself into the pure antagonism between life and death. And life is identified with the proletariat, who are not simply the poor, but rather those who have to support themselves through their own labor. And that conflict will lead to the inevitable victory of the working masses, who will transcend capitalism with the new knowledge that they have, that human society has gained, that there shall be then a return to the immediacy. But this return to the immediacy will not simply be like a return for a lack of knowledge, but rather basically that, you know, Adam returns to the Garden of Eden having eaten from the tree of knowledge, now knowing why he should be in the garden, basically. And the interesting element, and I mean, people have done. Roland Bohr is a very good author on this. He has analyzed very concisely, I think, the extensive biblical elements of this. But the importance that I don't think that he notes is specifically that this biblical element is mediated by anti-enlightenment, counter-enlightenment thought, and the I mean, even Rousseau, like Rousseau's like counter-enlightenment tendencies, I think come from his Christianity. That what you basically find in this period is that there is a great identification with Christianity, religion, and so forth against the Enlightenment, against sort of Enlightenment ideals, like, you know, liberation from religion or whatever. And it's there, I think, that you see the most obvious elements of this kind of Marxist, like the underlying sort of ideas of Marxism. And I think that is really where you get, the core overlap between integralism, reactionary thought, and Marxism. And I mean, it's why liberals do attack Marxism as, like, you know, reactionary, anti-progressive, so forth. I mean, people like Hannah Arendt do this, and quite a lot of people do this. That Marx is seen somewhat as a fuddy-duddy who's dealing in like apocalypticism, messianicism, so forth. And the reason is because he is emerging from a milieu of
But
Chris-
that is the fashion, as it were. That's
and
what you do.
yeah, that is the fashion, and I mean it's also pretty based. I think it's based and red pilled compared to someone who's like, oh, you can't go around predicting the end of the world. That's like bad or whatever. The other interesting element here is that, you know, I'd suggest, like, if anyone's interested in this stuff, Roland Bohr is very good. Katowski, actually, I mean, Katowski's writings on this is very interesting. He writes about Christianity for quite, like, he has like a multi-volume work on the development of Christianity, and I mean, even Engels' own writings on religion are quite interesting in this regard, because Engels basically interprets, and I mean, he's doing this kind of in a double manner, in that he goes and looks at the German Reformation, but he's also then talking about the descendants of the German Reformation and the Peasants' War, namely these kinds of apocalyptic hermeticists and mystics that were running around, like Oettinger, like various people that Engels and Marx interacted with, and so forth. And these kinds of mystics that do exist have a very what I can only call like organic understanding of reality, and really this concept of that the true way of life is a kind of immediacy in the self-knowledge and self-possession that one has in God, the kind of life that one has in the Swiss commune, in like the society in Acts, and Marx, as far as I can tell, agrees with a lot of this, uses the terminology of this, spouts these kinds of ideas, and is reacting to a social group that believe these same ideas. So there's an interesting element there. I mean, the most overt, I think, connection that you see here, really, of how there is this great interaction, especially at the start, is in Engels' use of Schelling. That Engels is using Schelling to critique Hegel, and understand like dialectical materialism, as he calls it. And Schelling is like he's a reactionary. Like he is he believes in feudalism. Like he wants to bring back feudalism. He is a supporter of the Prussian state, and a defender of the monarchy.
And plus, what is more feudal than than the quite literal feudal cantons of Switzerland? Like,
and so and that you see this quite a lot, that like the group of people that he is talking to and about are these reactionaries. And so I think I've talked for quite a long time now, but it's that I think is basically where I see the current interactions.
again, this to allow I am to like drink a glass of water because I could feel his vocal cords straining there at the end. So it's some right wing circles, and well, but basically all the right wing that is anti-capitalist also kind of emerged from this esoteric, romantic, mysticist, eschatological, and I suppose Marxist milieu. Like, this is the origin point. Like, this milieu, this is again Charles X, the last true Bourbon on the throne of France, carried out actions that are as much as could be in line with this. The Meister would also probably, I mean, the Meister was out and out anti-capitalist, wasn't he? Like, well, he was.
Yeah, he was very.
It's from this early, anti-capitalist and extremely anti-Jansenist. While we're at it,
he was mad on the Jansenists,
which apparently were playing an important role in the de-Christianization of France, something none of us knew. But to veer back onto topic, so from this milieu, we can essentially see right-wing anti-capitalist thought as an outgrowth. Basically, Marxism and its various forms and anti-capitalist right-wing thought are basically the two strains of the same seed, I suppose.
Yeah, the same sort of romantic.
Yeah, I mean, both are extremely heavily mediated by like German idealism. Like, we see this in the conservatives in the conservative revolutionaries of the 1920s, or give or take, where they exalt this kind of unmediated man against capitalism, against the degeneracy of the bourgeoisie, and in the left, although not quite in the Soviet Union, but like in European sides, you had Gramsci. God damn it! I have to review my names.
Yeah, Gramsci. Yeah, I mean Gramsci was taking more from Croce, Benedetto Croce. He's quite different. I mean, the closest person who maintains this, I think, is Lenin. If you go look at Lenin and Trotsky's writings, they still have this.
And thank you for that excellent segue. So again, I know a lot of our listeners probably don't go about reading I don't goddamn know. Like, what's the organizational structure of a Soviet? Because a Soviet is a council. In that, basically, the organization by Soviets or council or by councils. We really shouldn't be using the word council because council communism is different. But basically, the 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 administration by Soviets in its earliest written form, not in the later Stalinist and Civil War application of it, was essentially just rationalized feudalism. Like it's essentially just a pyramid basically of what amounted to like feudal councils, from peasant councils to noble councils, all the way to the royal council, in which you had a representative of the councils below being sent to the above, etc., etc., etc. And
Eventually,
and
national councils.
and as I am mentioned, this is like the last manifestation of this I suppose the OG roots of Marxism. And
The interesting thing sorry to interrupt here. The interesting element you actually point out about councils there, and is that the key Marxist critique basically of democratic socialism, i.e. Lassalle, and of state socialism, and of liberalism as such, is the concept of centralization from below. And you find this in Katowski, you find this in Lenin, you find this in Trotsky. The thing that they emphasize, and you find this even in the concept of democratic centralism, that what democratic centralism is centralization from below, and then that the highest power is a servant to the base, and that, like, that's just like what, like like that's like that is the basic ideology of a monarchy.
and to go full circle, we might consider a lot of these things radical, but no, these were actually contemporary to monarchies. And I recommend anyone to try and look up the Circle of Burgundy, not the Burgundian Circle, that's the Holy Roman Empire internal division, like the Circle of Burgundy, which was a group of French reformers that were around the Duc de Bourgogne during the Regency in France, and these were all aristocrats, clericals, and etc. So, and before the French Revolution, might I add, so unlikely to be leftists and communists and revolutionaries, they underlined a series of reforms to conduct to the absolute system, which was themed polysynoity. Those more knowledgeable might know that a system like this was eventually put into place, though I will say outright that that's the system that was eventually put into place was a farce and a sham. And we see this notion of polysynoidal in other monarchies, namely the Habsburg monarchy of Spain and its various councils, etc., etc. I guess the main point this somewhat circular episode has been trying to make is that perhaps the leftists and the monarchists are not so far apart in the end goals.
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway is counter-revolutionaries should read Marx.
That would be, that would be amazing. I think you should do that. I think the one thing actually to point out about like monarchism and socialism, I would actually ironically say that the moment at which the two groups seriously separated, because Gramsci, so forth, they are reading, Gramsci followed, he followed the philosopher of fascism. I can't remember his name now.
D'Annunzio?
Not D'Annunzio. Oh, the one who Ghost wrote the Fascist Manifesto.
Oh God, I have his fucking face. He looked the guy who there's a picture of him and D'Annunzio, and D'Annunzio looks like his average self, a sex god, and you have this most
Yeah.
Who did you say?
Ambry?
No. D'Ambry wasn't a philosopher. D'Ambry was a child though. But no, okay, I can't remember his name. He like theory of,
Chile?
huh?
No. I
Is
don't.
this like theory?
We'll never know.
Anyway, we'll never know. He's the philosopher of fascism. If you know him, you'll know him. But Gramsci read him, and the interesting element, basically, of when I
Giovanni Gentile?
yeah, Gentile, that's the one. Gramsci read Gentile, read Croce, read various right-wing people. Engels obviously read Schelling, read all kinds of shit like that, and same for Katowski. I think the same for Lenin. I'm not sure, but basically, I think the place at which they definitively split was the Cercle Proudhon. Sorel and Sorel and
Marat.
yeah, Marat. Reason for that being that I think after that broke down, and especially after the rise of fascism, I think you get a moment at which a lot of the sort of reactionary elements begin to align themselves towards fascism, and towards, especially because of fascist affirmations of things like national syndicalism. And I think part of that is quite self-serving, in the same way that people like became more Stalinist under Stalin, because you see a sort of similar thing with um, like the left after Lenin starts handing out money, um, because they've got a state now. Everyone becomes a Leninist. Ironically, the interesting element, though, ironically, is that Sorel was the philosopher of syndicalism, of like revolutionary trade unionism, and Sorel's political philosophy that underlies revolutionary trade unionism is obviously still exalted, but I think basically because of him and fascism, and his relationship to fascism, he basically became the kind of dividing line between the left and these reactionary elements. And once they had a dividing line, then they were split. Proudhon himself, I believe, was fairly sort of significantly Sorel himself, it's hard to characterize, but he essentially gave a Bergsonian interpretation of Marx that ironically ends up right back at the place, like the organicist position, which is quite interesting in itself. The more long-term thing that's quite interesting about this is that I think, yeah, basically, I think what people basically, I think Sorel is post Sorel. I think there's a clear delineation, and more generally post World War One, because World War One really did divide the left and the right, because for the sort of revolutionary left, it was World War One more than anything else that, you know, showed them, like, in their mind, showed who was a revolutionary, who wasn't. Did you support the war? Then you were an enemy. Was the basic feeling on the far left. I mean, you see this with Gramsci is actually a very good example of this, because Gramsci has a letter to Trotsky wherein Gramsci complains that Marinetti and the futurists had just become reactionaries by supporting the war. He writes this in 1918, like 20. So basically, I would say 1920s Cercle Proudhon is the last period in which there is a significant overlap between the revolutionary right, or sorry, the counter-revolutionary right, counter-French revolutionary right, and the radical left.
So it can be said that in order to return to tradition with a V, we need to read Marx.
Yeah, I mean that would be the logical conclusion. If you really want to return to tradition, go read Schelling and Engels, Dialectics of Nature. That would be
Interesting that it's all born out of a roommate's squabble.
Obviously, that's exactly what I think it is.
God, Matt, we're going to get a few poignant questions on this one, aren't we?
Well, I mean that's
I already assume we've been cancelled.
Oh well, no better time.
We are the most recent victims of cancel culture.
I mean,
second only to the Minneapolis police.
That's a bit spicy. I think to sort of conclude and to leave something, I think generally on like in monarchist groups, there is a kind of reflexive anti-intellectualism. I think that would be fair to say. And I think if people want to understand the primary claims of monarchism, and more generally of the right in general, I think the place you have to look is counter-enlightenment thought, and not simply counter-enlightenment thought as a kind of reflexive anti-rationalism. I mean, people like Schelling aren't irrationalists, and I think the consequence of this basically is that of this reflexive anti-rationalism that exists in the far right now, is that it is unable to mount coherent critiques of people like Marx. I mean, I can think of articles that right-wingers have written on, or like anything in really that I find in NRX circles. There's this significant misunderstanding of left-wing thought, and there's a kind of approaching them from a distance element, which I really don't think is necessary. I mean, it's like Marxist.org has literally everything imaginable for free, and yeah, I mean that's, I think, basically just go and read is the best.
Yeah, to slightly modify the common abbreviation of RTFM, read the fucking manual. I think we need to read the fucking Marx. You know, just go read it. Don't beat around the bush. Just come on. What are you doing? Come on, go read it.
Sounds like good advice. So yeah, to leave on that yeah, I think that's the conclusion.
A highly controversial note.
Yeah, and so if it's sidestepping from that, we'd just like to, say that big up, as it were, to the people in America and indeed around the world who are doing their bit to fight racial injustice, and best of luck.
Indeed. And to one last thing, in case, listener, by episode, I don't even know what episode we're on.
13.
Oh wow, quite a number. In case, listener, until at episode, and it took you this far to figure out, but none of us in this are pro-capital, as it were. So, understandably, we are pro literally everything that strikes down at capitalistic oppression and the direct outflow of capitalistic oppression, racial oppression. So.
And I mean, obviously, Black Lives Matter. I mean, come on.
It's not very organic. It's not very integralist, I think, to have a police force.
No, I mean, it's not very organic to be racist. Come on. So yeah, that's pretty much our.
This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I've been one of your hosts, McCosk.
Been Bronze.
Well, I am. I've been talking for close to an hour now. I'm gonna go get a drink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See ya. To both the you and the viewers, listeners, or whatever else it may be. Yeah. See ya. And don't forget to, smash the like button, subscribe, re-Spotify us, blog us, the Snapchats and all that. See ya.